Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kay Jacobson, and I'm a librarian at the Ramsey County Libraries. And today, I'd like to welcome you to our second session for the summer in our Tuesday with the Scholar program. Today's session is going to be on the war at home, Minnesota during the Great War, 1914 to 1920, with our presenter, Greg Gaut. Before I get to that, just a few things. Today's program is brought to you through the cooperation between the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Minnesota with the Ramsey County Libraries, and we are so thankful to both of these organizations for making these possible. So, a little bit about Greg. He published on, came out March 4th, 2025 from the Minnesota Historical Society Press, his book, The War at Home, which he looks at Minnesota during the war years of World War I and the wild events that were happening here during World War I. He became an independent researcher and historical, having problems saying my words today, consultant in 2012 after he retired from teaching history at the when was it Winona State or St. Mary's?
St. Mary's.
St. Mary's. I was going to say it's in Winona, and I was like, it's
Yeah.
not Winona State though. And he has included research of historic Minnesota properties and preparation. He's works for nominating places to the National Register of Historic Places and for landmark status under local preservation ordinances. He also loves libraries and has published short books about two of his favorites. One is Laird's, okay, I've said this right, Laird's Legacy, A History of the Winona Public Library, and Reinventing the People's Library, which is about the Carnegie Library, which was in Arlington Hills neighborhood of St. Paul, which is currently the East Side Freedom Library. He's contributed several articles to Minnesota History, the Journal of the Minnesota Historical Society, and he's written many landmark columns for that journal. So I think we've got everything settled. I think we're ready to get into this, and I'm going to hand things over to Greg.
Okay, I'm going to do the share screen now.
Okay.
Okay, I'll begin then. Thank you very much, Kay, for that introduction. I'm really happy to be able to talk to this audience about my new book. It's a book that I worked on for a long time, actually about 12 years. I originally thought I was going to write an article about what was called the Home Guard, something that you'll hear about in just a minute, but it kept getting larger and larger and it became a book. And it became a book thanks to the Minnesota Historical Society. I did a lot of research in the archives there in St. Paul, and then eventually they became the publisher of the book, and I really appreciate what they've done. I feel like when I'm writing a book like this, I'm kind of standing on the shoulders of a number of other historians who worked in this field, written books about this, and just sort of continuing a dialogue with other historians and with you about what happened during this period, which I think was really important. So how I came to write this book was really that originally when I went to graduate school at the University of Minnesota and taught history in a college level, I taught modern European and modern Russian history. And when you're in that world of teaching modern European and modern Russian history, no one ever doubts the significance of World War I. It's like the largest thing that happened. Sometimes people would say it's even more significant than World War II. There was a massive carnage, 10 million soldiers and millions more civilians died. There's a generation of traumatized veterans, many disabled or horribly disfigured. There was the collapse of four different empires, the Russian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the German and the Ottoman empires, and the redrawing of the maps of Europe and the Middle East, for better or for worse. There was the weakening even of the victorious nations like Britain, France, and Italy. Mass killing was industrialized and, in a sense, normalized. And then, of course, all that set the stage for the rise of fascism. So when I started reading more about Minnesota history, this is about 20 years ago now, I was surprised that in general surveys of Minnesota history, World War I was passed over as if it was of little importance. And I said to myself, that can't be right. That just can't be right for everything I know about World War I. And early on, I read an important book by David Kennedy about what happened during World War I on the American home front. David Kennedy is a major historian. You may know him from his kind of classic book on the Depression. His book about the World War I home front has got a clever title. He called it Over Here. And there I read the following. He said, Americans went to war in 1917 not only against Germans in the field of France, but against each other at home. What happened on the home front, he said, was a deadly serious contest to determine the consequences of the crisis for the character of the American economic, social, and political life. That sounded right to me. That sounded more like what was happening in Minnesota. What he had in mind was that in 1914, when the war broke out in Europe, there was a lot of things going on in this country. There was a jarring transition to industrial capitalism dominated by large corporations and trusts. There was a mass migration from Europe that was going on and a nativist backlash against immigrants. There was astounding economic inequality, which began during the Gilded Age. There was the rise of militant trade unionism, including the Industrial Workers of the World. There was populist farmer organizations. There was the rise of the Socialist Party led by Eugene Debs. There was a great migration of African Americans from south to north, and the rise of the NAACP and other organizations to fight against Jim Crow, discrimination, and the plague of lynching. And there was the final push for the women's suffrage movement for voting rights. And then finally, as if all those things weren't enough, there was a mass movement demanding the prohibition of alcohol production and sales. There's a lot of things going on in this country in 1914. And when you think that all of these conflicts and all of these changes would just stop because war broke out in Europe, no, they didn't stop, hardly. And so my question was, how did all those things play out in Minnesota? And what I found, and what I argue in the book, is that Minnesota was in fact one of the hot spots of this war at home, the struggle for the home front, not only because of all these conflicts that were all churning in Minnesota at that time, but also because the war itself was controversial. In the period between the outbreak of war in Europe, which was July 1914, and the US declaration of war on Germany in April of 1917, there was an intense debate throughout the country, and especially in places like Minnesota, about whether the US should stay neutral in the war or whether they should intervene in the war in Europe. And places like Minnesota, and I would also say Wisconsin, probably the majority view was for neutrality. Minnesota was a deeply polarized state in this period for all these reasons, all coming together at the same time. And that's what this book is about, the battles that raged in Minnesota during the war, when the state government was, for a time, I argue, one of the most repressive in the nation. I was interested in the impact this had on the state, but also, I'm also interested, I'll come back to this later in the talk, about how it changed the lives of individuals. How did this happen, that Minnesota experienced World War I in this way? So I think the starting point is to think about the context of Minnesota during that time, especially in the Twin Cities, because there was in the Twin Cities business leaders who were highly organized and highly unified, led by the Minneapolis grain millers, the Washburns, the Crosbys, the Pillsburys, the big banks. Actually, there was two big banks, manufacturers. They were all really working together in a highly unified and highly organized fashion. They tended to have a common heritage. That is to say, they were what you could call Yankees. That is to say, men of English or Scottish origin who worshiped in the same churches, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Congregationalist. They lunched at the Minneapolis Club and strategized at the Minneapolis Club. This is the Minneapolis Club, by the way, which still exists, although I'm sure it's nothing like the important hub that it was in 1914, they formed organizations which were committed to keeping unions out of the state, fighting for what they called the open shop. And they were very effective and very successful. But in 1916, in the third year of the war, before the US had entered the war, during 1916, three things happened in Minnesota that shook them up and got them quite worried. The first was the rise of labor militancy in the Twin Cities, but also up north. There was a wildcat strike on the Iron Range, which the IWW, the International Workers of the World, led. And then after that, there was another strike among lumberjacks, also led by the IWW. Both those strikes fizzled out, were broken, but nevertheless, the significance of the IWW up there in the north really was worrisome to the business leaders. The second thing was the election, believe it or not, of a socialist to be the mayor of Minneapolis. Tom Van Leer was elected in 1916. He was a member of the Socialist Party, but he was what you might call a pragmatic socialist. He made very clear that a socialist society was what he sought in the long run, but in the short run, he focused on very local municipal issues, one of which was getting a better deal between Minneapolis and St. Paul and the private company that ran the public transportation system, the Twin Cities Rapid Transit Company. We'll come back to that in a little bit also. Now, he didn't have a great deal of power as the mayor of Minneapolis, but he did have one significant power that scared the business community, and that was he had control of the police department. And they felt that in a strike situation, they would worry about what Tom Van Leer would do. But the third thing that upset the business community, and the biggest thing, was this. In 1916, a new farmers organization called the Nonpartisan League swept to power in North Dakota. They won the governor's race. They took control of one of the two houses of the North Dakota legislature and soon had control of both sides. This was an organization that was formed just a couple years earlier by a guy named Arthur Townley and some other people in North Dakota to try to get a better deal, especially for wheat farmers, with their relationship with the grain millers in Minneapolis, St. Paul. They felt they were being screwed, that they had little power to bargain with the grain millers. They were also feeling oppressed by the railroads. And so they formed this organization seeking political power to try to even the playing field from their point of view. So this was the last in a long series of populist farmer organizations. And it had maybe you might say, a new strategy. It was called the Nonpartisan League because their idea was to run for office within the open primaries of the established parties, which practically speaking usually meant the Republicans because the Democratic Party in North Dakota and Minnesota was not very strong. And that's what they had done. They had basically won the Republican primary, swept to victory, and now we're beginning to put their program into practice in North Dakota. One of those programs, by the way, still exists, and that was the formation of the North Dakota State Bank, give better credit terms to farmers, and that still exists, and it still is a thriving bank in North Dakota. The problem was, from the business community's point of view in Minneapolis, is that having one power in North Dakota, the Nonpartisan League made it very clear that their next target was Minnesota. And in fact, they moved their national office to downtown St. Paul. So in March of 1917 now, when it looked like the US was about to enter the war in Europe by declaring war on Germany, the business community was concerned about these three things. They were also concerned about the fact that everyone understood that the 4 units of the Minnesota National Guard, 3 infantry and 1 field artillery, were going to be federalized, meaning that the federal government was going to federalize the National Guard units of Minnesota and every other state and bring them to the East Coast and eventually ship them to France to fight on the Western Front against Germany. You may be aware that when the U.S. declared war on Germany in April of 1917, the U.S. had very little military. And so federalizing the National Guard units was one part of building a big army. The other part, of course, was the selective service system, which was going to draft thousands of men very, very quickly. So they went to the legislature. This is the business community now. They went to the legislature. And I should say they were also concerned about the fact that Minnesota had a biennial legislature that was about to adjourn for 2 years. And so they went to the legislature with a plan to create what they called the Minnesota Commission of Public Safety, and to give that commission the power to basically rule the state for the duration of the war. And although the legislature only had about 3 weeks before it adjourned, it passed this remarkable piece of legislation, which gave this Commission of Public Safety, which was the governor, the attorney general, and 5 men appointed by the governor, the power to rule in the absence of the legislature for the duration of the war. And here's the Commission of Public Safety, at least in its final version. There were some changes. It was the governor, the attorney general, and 5 members appointed by the governor, all of whom were at the beginning conservative businessmen except one, and that was John Lind, who was the former governor of Minnesota and a Democrat. But the person who was most important in the Commissioner of Public Safety was this man, John F. McGee, who was a Minneapolis lawyer. He had been a district court judge, and then he went back into private practice. He represented the grain millers, the railroads, etc. And he was a powerful personality. And although the governor was on the commission and was supposedly the chair of the commission, the governor was only 34 years old, and John McGee basically became the de facto leader. He was an extreme conservative nationalist. He hated trade unions, the Socialist Party, the International Workers of the World, the Nonpartisan League, and thought that extreme measures should be taken, against them. Just to give you one little example, there's lots in the book about John McGee, but in 1918, he was invited to Washington to testify at a Senate hearing. There was conservative senators who were introducing a bill to take cases of sedition and take them out of the civil courts and put them into military courts. So essentially civilians could be court-martialed for saying the wrong thing. And John McGee went to testify in favor of that bill, which is something he was very much in favor of. And what he said in this hearing that was publicized all around the country was this. He said, "Where we made a mistake was in not establishing a firing squad in the first days of the war. We should now get busy and have that firing squad working overtime. These men who are fighting against our soldiers this side of the water and stabbing them in the back are going to die. All socialists should be in internment camps." Well, he said a lot of other things privately, but this was actually his formal testimony within the Senate hearing. So the stage was set for conflict. And McGee worked very quickly to build up the forces that the Commission for Public Safety had at its disposal. The first one, and the most important one, I guess, was the Home Guard, which is something I was interested in from the beginning of this. So, as I mentioned, the Minnesota National Guard was soon to leave the state and become part of the federal army. And so McGee set up a Home Guard, which was basically volunteers, mostly businessmen and professional men, who set up battalions around the state. Eventually, there was 21 battalions, and was essentially a businessman's militia. And this was something that they were thinking about would come in handy if there were strikes or other disturbances during the war, something that they might have relied on the National Guard for, but now since the National Guard was gone, they would have their own kind of businessman's militia to operate. The Home Guard was augmented by the Motor Corps. So in addition to the Home Guard, which of course was all volunteer soldiers on foot, one of the auto dealers in Minneapolis, Win Stevens, came to the commission and said, "What we need is a Motor Corps. I can organize businessmen who own cars into similar battalions that will give mobility to the Home Guard." So here's a picture we're seeing now of a Motor Corps training camp in Lake City. The Minnesota National Guard had a training camp in Lake City at that time, and they brought together a bunch of men with their cars. These are volunteer Motor Corps men, mostly businessmen, who brought with them their cars. They had to have a touring car, meaning that it was a 5-passenger car. And so they volunteered with their cars, and they eventually formed 10 battalions of over 2,400 businessmen in their automobiles. Then there was also, the commission had its own police officers. It could count on the cooperation of most of the sheriffs in the 86 counties of Minnesota. There was 86 counties at the time. There's 87 now. There was also many patriotic organizations that they could rely on, the Stars and Stripes League, the American First Association, etc. But the most remarkable thing, I think, at the time was this organization, which was called the American Protective League. And this is a badge that I'll explain in a second. So at that time, this is years before the FBI was established. The Federal Bureau of Investigation didn't have many detectives or officers around the country. So a businessman in Chicago formed this organization of kind of amateur sleuths, amateur detectives, and organized a chapter in Chicago and then started organizing chapters around the country. And he went to the Justice Department and he said, we can supply manpower to you to investigate crimes, investigate disloyal people, to investigate maybe draft evaders and other slackers, as they were called at the time. And the Justice Department accepted their offer. And not only that, but not only sanctioned them as kind of a group of amateur detectives that were going to go around and open mail and arrest people, etc., but even gave them badges. Here's a captain's badge. It says American Protective League, and it said Secret Service in the middle, I guess. I don't know why, to make them feel pretty cool, I suppose. So in Minneapolis, the Minneapolis business community thought this was terrific, and they organized a Minneapolis branch of the American Protective League that eventually had, they claimed, about 250 amateur detectives, and they even got an office in the federal building to run this protective league. This is really a remarkable thing because these people had no vetting. They were not, I mean, they were just amateurs who came together as an organization, volunteered, and their work was accepted by the federal government, at least for a while. Eventually, they overplayed their hand. Maybe I'll just tell this story very quickly before we go on. One of the things the American Protective League did was what was called slacker raids, where they would try to find draft evaders by cordoning off a whole area of downtowns like Minneapolis or St. Paul and Duluth on a Saturday night, and then taking into custody every young man unless he had on his possession papers that indicated that he was not eligible or not at that point eligible or being drafted. And so they literally arrested thousands of people in these big sweeps. What happened usually is that by the next day, girlfriends and wives and mothers brought their draft papers down to these bullpens where they were being held, and almost everyone was released, and it didn't actually result in many arrests, but it was really quite a dramatic thing. So going downtown to St. Paul, for example, on a Saturday night to play pool or see a movie or whatever, or go to a dance, if you were a young man, you might very well be arrested, at least held overnight. Eventually, the American Protective League kind of overplayed its hand. As I said, these slacker raids got bigger and bigger and bigger. And finally, later in the summer of 1918, they held a 3-day slacker raid in New York City, in Manhattan. And they arrested about 100,000 people, and they brought all of commerce to a halt in the nation's economic capital for 3 full days. And at that point, even conservative senators in Congress said, wait a minute, this is going too far. Who are these people? And they said, no, I think we think now that the laws of the United States should be enforced by sworn officers and not by these amateurs. And so the American Protective League kind of went by the wayside. But in 1917 and through most of 1918, it was a very powerful organization, especially in Minnesota. So by the summer of 1917, John McGee had these different forces in place, and the commission was ready, and the war at home was about to begin. And the thing I think that really kind of sparked it was what happened in New Ulm, Minnesota. So I think you're probably aware New Ulm is a very German town. And by the way, I was just there last week, and it's really a wonderful place to visit. I was speaking there about this book, and it was really interesting to speak about it there in New Ulm. But what happened in New Ulm was when the Selective Service Act was passed, it started off with a draft registration on June 7th of 1917. So men had to register. And then in July, orders started coming down about how many men each county was going to have to draft. And this had a really devastating impact on New Ulm, because New Ulm was full of obviously German Americans, including many recent immigrants from Germany. And they were in touch with families back home, and they knew that many of their family members back home or relatives back home were already in the German army, some of whom were already at the front on the Western Front in France. And so they thought about how a young German American man from New Ulm, if he was drafted, could very well end up not just figuratively, but literally fighting against their relatives across no man's land on the Western Front in France. It was really troubling to people. Now, before the U.S. entered the war, places like New Ulm were united around the notion of neutrality. They were really hoping, and they were doing everything they could to support Woodrow Wilson's policy of neutrality. And once the U.S. diverged from that policy and entered the war, it was a really difficult and painful thing for German Americans generally, but certainly in New Ulm. So what happened was some of the young men approached the leaders of New Ulm and said, is there something that can be done about this? And it was decided to organize a meeting, a gathering, which became kind of a rally at Turner Hall in New Ulm. Turner Hall still exists, by the way. I had dinner there a couple nights ago. And as you see there, this is the poster for it: enter a protest against sending American soldiers to a foreign country. So the view of the leaders in New Ulm was that, okay, there's a draft. We have to follow the law. If people are drafted, they have to go. But we'd like to petition the U.S. government to say that although we have a draft, that the draft should not include sending men abroad to fight in a war on another continent against their will. Only volunteers should do that. And so there was a rally. It got bigger and it got more provocative than they expected, but that was what they tried to do. There was a petition to that effect. And the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety had agents in the audience taking down everything everyone said, and then they really came down hard, especially on these two men. So this is the mayor of New Ulm and the city attorney of New Ulm, Dr. Louis Fritchie and Albert Feinder. And the Minnesota Commission on Public Safety used its rather plenary powers to remove both of them from office. And then they faced some other problems too. Now, these guys are interesting. One of the kind of characters I like to follow through throughout the book, because you might think that people like Fritchie and Feinder were either German nationalists who only cared about Germany, or maybe they were pacifists, or maybe both. And that was not exactly true. Both Fritchie and Feinder were majors in the Minnesota National Guard. Louis Fritchie was a doctor. He was the second in command of the medical unit for the Minnesota National Guard. Albert Feinder led a part of the Minnesota National Guard along the Mexican border for 8 months just before the U.S. entered the war. He just got back from this 8-month tour of duty along the Mexican border when war was declared on the U.S. These guys were longtime National Guard officers, but they were deeply troubled by what was going on, and they thought it was at least valid to peacefully petition to see whether the Selective Service Act could be changed. And they were really wrong, and they got in a lot of trouble. Now, they said some things along the way that I think really sealed their fate. They suggested, a couple of them suggested in their speeches that if there had been a referendum on the war, the U.S. probably would not have entered the war. In other words, suggesting that the war did not have popular support, which was certainly true, but that certainly angered people on the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety. So this proves that they are disloyal. By the way, there was 2 other speakers at this rally that were also punished. One was the editor of the New Ulm Review, the newspaper, Albert Steinhauser. He was eventually charged under the Federal Espionage Act for seditious statements in his paper. And the other one was Reverend Adolf Ackerman, believe it or not, the president of Martin Luther College, who they couldn't remove him, but they did. The Commission for Public Safety put a lot of pressure on the board of Martin Luther College to fire him, which they eventually did. So this kind of now began the really intense part of the war at home. It was kind of the thing that triggered a lot of the activity that went afterwards. I want to mention just like 2 big crisis points of the war at home, two big kind of battles, if you will. The first one was the transit strike in the winter of 1917, October, November, December of 1917. So I mentioned already, I think many people are aware that the Minnesota or the Twin Cities had this massive streetcar system stretched all the way from Lake Minnetonka to White Bear Lake. I think at one point you could even get all the way to Stillwater on a streetcar. And it was owned and run by a private company. And in the fall of 1917, some of the transit workers for the Twin Cities Rapid Transit Company tried to organize a union. And they were fired, and then it provoked this whole labor crisis that eventually even led to a brief general strike in St. Paul. The Minnesota Commission for Public Safety very much sided with the company. The company made it clear they weren't going to negotiate with anybody. The United States sent federal mediators in. They were trying to mediate the strike and bring people back to work, even if it meant a union contract. But the company wouldn't budge, and eventually the strike was broken. In the meantime, there was some violence, especially against streetcars, by some angry people. And so the Commission for Public Safety mobilized the Home Guard. And here were some of the Home Guard men. They came from all over the place, from Winona, Owatonna, Anoka. Various Home Guard battalions were shipped in by train to patrol the streets of St. Paul during the strike. You see they're armed with pistols and with clubs. Well, the strike failed, but one very interesting thing happened during the strike that's very important in the long run. The Nonpartisan League, which is an organization of farmers, knew that in order to win any election in Minnesota, which unlike North Dakota, they would need more than farmer votes. And so they were reaching out to the labor movement, especially in the Twin Cities. They came and they supported the strike, and the labor movement was very appreciative of this. And so we have the beginnings of a coalition between farmers organized by the Nonpartisan League and the labor movement, at least in the Twin Cities. And that alliance would grow and grow over the next several years and eventually would become the Farmer Labor Party. The other thing that happened, and this was kind of the crisis point, the culmination of the war at home, was that in June of 1918, the Nonpartisan League finally made its political move. As I mentioned, they ran their candidates in the open primaries, usually of the Republican Party, and the Republican Party was having a primary in June 1918, and Governor Burnquist was running for re-election. So they nominated a candidate to run against him, and that candidate was Charles A. Lindbergh Sr., who had been in Congress for 10 years, representing the 6th District. The 6th District, he was from Little Falls, by the way. The 6th District was basically in the center of the state, from around Little Falls up to the Canadian border. He had resigned from Congress in 1917. He had been an opponent of the war, favored neutrality. And if he had been in Congress still when they voted for the war in April 1917, he probably would have voted no. In any case, he was very much a radical populist. He made his name in Congress by trying to rein in what populists called the money trust, that is to say, Wall Street, by having more democratic control over the banking system. And in 1917, he was a private citizen, and the Nonpartisan League nominated him for governor in 1918. And so began an incredible campaign. Here's Lindbergh campaigning in a typical kind of situation. This is in Cottonwood, Minnesota. These campaigns were usually outside on a farmer's field. And the campaign was quite remarkable. By this time, through the work of the Minnesota Commission of Public Safety and the sheriffs, et cetera, it was almost impossible, or actually was impossible, for the Nonpartisan League to campaign in at least 20 counties. And where they were able to campaign, violence often broke out. And so, and in fact, in the end, Lindbergh was even arrested a week before the election, the primary election, merely for showing up to campaign for the Nonpartisan League, because the local county attorney, this was in Martin County, said that the Nonpartisan League was outlawed in his state. So this is very difficult to campaign when you're essentially outlawed from campaigning. It's really a kind of a remarkable thing, as if someone in one county said Democrats or Republicans can't campaign here. I mean, that's basically what was going on. Even the Home Guard around the state was used to stop the Nonpartisan League from campaigning. So one of the things the Nonpartisan League liked to do, especially at the end of the campaign period, a week before the election, was they organized these motor caravans. Many farmers had cars, and many Nonpartisan League organizers had these Model Ts. And they would organize car caravans, which are sometimes 200 or 300 cars, and they drive around the county and come into a town to have a rally. When they came into town, there was often violence. Townspeople would rip off their Lindbergh posters, and there would be fighting. Fortunately, not many people had firearms at that time, but it was an incredibly violent campaign. I must say, just as a side, the thing that most surprised me in all my research about this was the incredible animosity between townspeople throughout Minnesota in small towns and in the cities, of course, and farmers. It was just remarkable how much hatred there was and anger between these two groups of people, even though they're obviously mutually dependent on each other. Well, when the election finally happened, Burnquist won, although Lindbergh won 43% of the vote and carried 30 counties. And here are the counties he carried. So the ones that are shaded are counties that Lindbergh got a majority in. And it's kind of an interesting thing to sort of see where the Nonpartisan League was strong at that time. So I'm going to get a little laser here. So you see up here along the Red River Valley, mostly wheat farmers up here, very similar to what was going on in North Dakota. The Nonpartisan League carried all of those counties. And then some central Minnesota counties also. Here's Morrison County, where Lindbergh was from. And then along the Minnesota River, up here, carried most of those counties also. There's a lot of German American farmers in those counties that may have helped. Notice that the bottom two tiers of counties along the Iowa border, none of them had a Lindbergh majority, a Nonpartisan League majority, for reasons I'm not exactly clear about. Maybe because the farming was there different or whatever. Burnquist also won in both Ramsey County and Hennepin County. Now, when I look at these election results more closely in all these counties, whether they are these counties that Lindbergh won or these counties that Lindbergh lost, you see a very clear pattern. So the election results are usually divided between towns and then what they call townships. The townships were the rural areas. And there was just a remarkable distinction. In almost every town, Burnquist carried a massive majority. And then right outside of town, in the townships surrounding a town, whatever the town might be, Moorhead or Alexandria or you name it, it was exactly the opposite. In the townships, the farmers voted overwhelmingly for Lindbergh. This was especially true, of course, in all these counties that Lindbergh won. But even these counties that he lost, you saw many rural townships voting for Lindbergh, but not enough to carry the county. Now, in the cities, in Hennepin and Ramsey County, another thing happened that was very interesting. Burnquist carried both those counties. You can see they're both in white. But in wards that were primarily working class wards, Lindbergh tended to carry the majority. And since we're talking about Ramsey County here, I have, in fact, the Ramsey County primary results. And it's kind of fun to see some actual data about what's going on. So Burnquist won the county. You can see down here at the bottom, he won the county very clearly, 11,795, 9,606. But some of the counties, many of the wards went the other way. In fact, Lindbergh had a majority in 8 of the 12 wards. So up here, for example, the first and second ward were basically the east side, Payne-Phelan neighborhoods. And you see in both those places, Lindbergh had a majority. The third and fourth wards were downtown. That's why there's not that many votes there. The fifth ward is West 7th Street area. You see Lindbergh did very well there. The sixth ward is West Side. He basically had a small majority there. And now look at the 7th ward. 2,565 to 481 for Lindbergh. Like a 5-to-1 majority. What ward do you think 7th ward is? And if you're guessing Summit Avenue and Summit Hill, you'd be correct. So you can see that incredible class distinction in terms of voting. So for example, the 11th Ward was Highland Park, 10th Ward, St. Anthony, so still stronger votes for Burnquist. The 8th Ward would be kind of like Frogtown North End. So this was a really interesting phenomenon. You sort of start thinking about what were people thinking. And it was really interesting that although Burnquist campaigned totally on the loyalty issue and supported by almost all the newspapers in the state, they all said Lindbergh and the Nonpartisan League are basically disloyal, they're socialists, they're good as Bolsheviks, they're treasonous, and if you vote for them, you're voting for treason. You have to vote for Burnquist and keep the party loyal, keep the county, keep the country and the state loyal. And nevertheless, many farmers and many workers nevertheless voted for Lindbergh. An interesting phenomenon. Now, what I'd like to do now, just to come to the end of this, is, let's see, read a few, oh no, excuse me, before I do that, I'm gonna do this. That's right, I forgot, I'm gonna do this too first. The other part of what I try to do in this book that's really important to me is focus on the impact of the war on individuals. And so I follow a number of characters through the book, and these are some of the characters. I'll introduce them in a second. But my idea is that and this applies to all of us, we are born into some particular context, which might be good or bad. It might be a context that gives us a lot of opportunities. It might be a context that gives us very few opportunities. This is sort of beyond our control. And also, if you're in a society that is suddenly overwhelmed by some national disaster or a war or an invasion, then your personal life is going to be transformed no matter what you think. You can say, I'm not interested in the war, but the war is interested in you, as the old saying goes. So for example, if you imagine yourself, if you were a Ukrainian, how has your life been changed over the last 3 years? It's been changed enormously, whether you wanted to or not. And the same is true, I think, during World War I. Even though World War I was fought in Europe, it had a big impact on everyone in the United States, and that's what I was kind of interested in following through. So let me just introduce some of these characters. Jens Grandal is a wonderful character. He was the editor of the Red Wing Daily Republican, a Norwegian immigrant. And before the U.S. declared war from 1914, 1915, he was a big proponent of neutrality. He thought the Europeans were crazy and the U.S. shouldn't get involved in the war. But once the U.S. got involved in the war, he completely changed his tune and became a powerful nationalist, and really represents a lot of what big newspapers and small town newspapers did, which was that they were so angry at the Nonpartisan League or the labor movement, whatever, that they were willing to throw kind of due process and civil rights out the window, and basically sometimes even condone mob violence. It's really an interesting thing. Jens Grandal is a good example of that. Many of you are probably familiar with Maria Sanford, kind of the legendary professor from the University of Minnesota. And I think a good example of a progressive intellectual who before the war was very much concerned about militarism and thinking that the US should retain neutrality. But war was declared, she really bought into President Woodrow Wilson's idea that this was a war for democracy, a war to end all war, and she became a big proponent of the war. She died in 1918, though, and didn't get to see how it actually turned out. Alice Ames Winter was a wealthy woman who lived around Lake of the Isles in the Twin Cities. She was a leader of the Women's Club movement. In fact, she was one of the founders of the Minneapolis Women's Club, which sadly just closed its doors last week or so. And she was appointed to be the head of the Women's Committee of the Commission for Public Safety. So you may be aware that in those days, there was many social organizations, the Masons, the Elks, the Moose, the Red Men, it goes on and on and on. And most of the time, those were men's organizations, but they often had a women's auxiliary. And so the Commission for Public Safety did the same thing and appointed Alice Ames Winter to lead that women's auxiliary, the Women's Committee. And it did a lot of interesting things. Clarence Wigington, you may be familiar with too, if you're from St. Paul, famous architect in St. Paul. African-American architect. He appears in the book not so much as an architect, but as one of the men in St. Paul who tried to do something about the terrible segregation of the military in the United States. So when the U.S. went to war, the U.S. military was completely segregated. The Minnesota National Guard was segregated. No African Americans were in the Minnesota National Guard. And so after the Home Guard got organized, Clarence Wigington and some other leaders of the African American communities in Minneapolis and St. Paul asked the governor if they could set up an African American unit of the Home Guard, which they did. It was called the 16th Battalion. It was not asked to do things like break strikes, etc., but it nevertheless was a little bit of a cracking open the door of segregation in the military of the U.S. and of Minnesota, which unfortunately the Minnesota National Guard was not not integrated until much later. Wigington, by the way, designed such things as the Highland Park Water Tower and the beautiful pavilion down in Harriet Park, which now bears his name, etc. Sarah Colvin was a nurse, St. Paul nurse, and she was a member of the National Women's Party. So you may be aware that when World War I broke out, the suffrage movement had a split. The main part of the suffrage movement thought, well, we'll support the war. Excuse me, I just went backwards there. We'll support the war, and after the war is over, because we supported the war, maybe we'll be in a better position to get the suffrage amendment finally passed by Congress. But the Women's Party, and Sarah Colvin was the leader of the Women's Party in Minnesota, thought that they should keep the pressure on President Wilson even during the war. They said, if Wilson thinks we should go over to Europe in order to advance democracy, maybe he should think about advancing democracy first in the United States by getting his party to support the suffrage amendment. And so they picketed the White House. Eventually, Sarah Colvin was arrested twice. And as part of this whole story about what happens to these social movements when they're caught up in the war. And finally, Ambrose Teague, very powerful lawyer in St. Paul, represented the railroads, grain millers, etc., and also the Twin Cities Transit Company. He actually wrote the statute that created the Commission for Public Safety and then became its chief counsel. And after the war, I think he had some misgivings about what had happened, especially the way John McGee had run the show. But his legal career kept blossoming. He eventually had a mansion on Summit Avenue, and then came to an untimely death. I must say that my favorite part of the book is the last part, which is called the epilogue, and then it's called Lives After Wartime, where I trace what happened to all these people after the war and how they changed. And I don't want to give away all the things that I learned there, but I'll just mention this one thing. This is the way the book ends. On November 11th, 2028, which was the 10th anniversary of the armistice ending World War I, Ambrose Teague shot himself at his Summit Avenue mansion. And I don't know why exactly he did this. He didn't leave a suicide note, but it just seemed like a remarkable coincidence that he chose that particular day, the 10th anniversary of the armistice. Well, so now I would like to do what I said I was going to do, which is just read a couple of short passages from the book to give you kind of a taste of what goes on in the countryside and the city, etc. And also to introduce another character. This is James Manahan, a St. Paul lawyer. He spent his whole career representing farmers and labor unions. And so when the National Nonpartisan League came to St. Paul, he became one of the attorneys for the Nonpartisan League and was sent around doing all kinds of things. And this is a little event that involved him. So what was happening out in the countryside, besides the violence I mentioned when the Nonpartisan League tried to campaign, was that some county attorneys in the counties were prosecuting Nonpartisan League organizers and leaders under a local state sedition statute. So you may know that the federal government passed this thing called the Federal Espionage Act, which is kind of a misleading title because the main part of it was a punishment for sedition, meaning speaking out against the war or saying something that would discourage enlistment could lead to a 20-year sentence. And there was some federal espionage prosecutions in Minnesota, but there was many more state prosecutions under the similar state statute. And so this is what was going on around the country. This is a story about kind of where this all began. So here we go. The first attempt by a county attorney to prosecute a nonpartisan league speaker was a clumsy one, more of a farce than a crime drama, although it could have easily degenerated into a lynching. When Jackson County officials got wind of a nonpartisan league meeting scheduled for January 23rd in Lakefield, E.H. Nicholas, the county attorney, wrote a letter to the nonpartisan league promising to, quote, use every measure at our disposal to prevent you from speaking here and to prevent your organization from holding any future meetings in this country. And this was going on in about 20 counties. Joseph Gilbert, the most important nonpartisan league leader after Arthur Townley, decided to personally challenge the band. Standing on a wagon in Lakefield, he began speaking to a group of farmers when he said, among other things, that some county officials spelled patriotism starting with the letters P-A-Y. The sheriff arrested him for riot. Several farmers made his bail, and he agreed to return for trial on February 11th. Attorneys James Manahan, you see here, and another attorney named Paddock came south to Lakefield to defend Gilbert at trial. The original charge of riot had been changed to unlawful assembly. Looking back years later, Manahan felt he underestimated how deeply small-town business owners and professionals hated the nonpartisan league. He thought he had made the prosecution's case look ridiculous. Pro-nonpartisan league farmers in the courtroom were gleeful. However, after most of the farmers went home to milk their cows, the judge called an evening session. During an extended dinner break, the prosecution found new witnesses. Near midnight, Manahan moved for adjournment till the morning. The judge refused, but did allow a man in the audience to auction a parrot. The parrot was named Kaiser Bill for the benefit of the Red Cross. Manahan saw a trap. If he bought the bird, he would be pro-German. If he did not, he'd be anti-Red Cross. He outbid everyone and bought the parrot for $15. Then he jumped on a table to start a new auction, challenging Nicholas, the county attorney, to prove his patriotism by bidding. In the ensuing uproar, the sheriff rearrested Gilbert. In a fit of anger, Manahan told the hostile townspeople that he would ask the farmers to boycott the town if Gilbert was not released. Farmers bailed out Gilbert a second time, and as the crowd grew more threatening, Manahan, Paddock, and Gilbert attempted a retreat. In his memoir, Manahan wrote that the mob caught him before he could reach the hotel. Someone yelled, "Get a rope!" He sheepishly recounted how he saved himself by telling the crowd that he was only a lawyer trying a case for a living and that he had no use for those damn socialists. The crowd agreed to let him go if he would drop Gilbert's case and leave town. The next day, Gilbert was convicted and was freed pending appeal. Well, that was just the beginning. Eventually, the three county attorneys in southern Minnesota got more organized and they got some convictions. And believe it or not, Arthur Townley, the head of the Nonpartisan League, and Joseph Gilbert, the main organizer, actually served some serious time in the Goodhue County Jail and the Jackson County Jail after the armistice in 1919. Gilbert served a whole year in the county jail after the war. Well, one more story, and then we'll open it up for questions. This is William Shaper, who was the University of Minnesota professor and actually the chair of the political science department. This is a story about the University of Minnesota and what was happening with academic freedom. So John McGee, the head of the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety, asked Fred Snyder, chair of the Board of Regents of the University of Minnesota, to investigate several university professors infected with what he called the germ of disloyalty. McGee wrote that the commission thought the matter could be safely entrusted to the regents. This decision made sense because Snyder was the Hennepin County director of the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety, and Governor Burnquist sat on the Board of Regents ex officio. McGee attached an unsigned statement that claimed all but one member of the German department was disloyal, and in addition, there were two other rabid pro-Germans in official positions, namely William Shaper, who you see here, and Alfred Ulrey, the dean of dentistry. Snyder consulted with Marion L. Burton, who had just become the university president, and the stage was set for an inquisition. When summoned before the regents in late summer, most of the professors, including all the German language faculty, established their loyalty. On September 13th, the board interrogated the last two, Dean Aker and Schaefer. The regents concluded that Aker, a mild-mannered pacifist, was a harmless eccentric and sent him back to work. Burton then summoned Shaper and informed him that the regents wanted to question him about his loyalty. With no idea why this was happening and no time to prepare, Shaper was ushered into the boardroom. What happened next marks a low point in the university's history. William Shaper was born in La Crosse, Wisconsin, the son of German immigrants. The University of Minnesota hired him in 1901, shortly after he had completed his doctorate at Columbia University. By 1917, he was the chair of the political science department and a respected scholar. Shaper bristled at what he felt were ridiculous insinuations and a humiliating process. He told the regents that although he did not oppose the war effort, he could not, quote, boost for the war, unquote, because he had relatives fighting on both sides. When asked what he meant by boosting, he replied, quote, that it was revolting to my conscience to go out and harangue public meetings for the purpose of arousing the war spirit, close quote. This response angered Pierce Butler, a well-known trial lawyer, and by the way, a future Supreme Court justice, who grilled Shaper as President Burton sat silently. You want the Kaiser to dominate the world, don't you? He demanded. Shaper, just as angry, responded that he thought Butler's question was utterly absurd. To men like Burton, Snyder, and Butler, however, the question was anything but absurd. They had internalized McGee's 100% loyalty ideology that branded a person who was not completely loyal as a traitor. Acquiescence was not enough. Boosting was exactly what they expected of university faculty. After almost 2 years of tense interchange, the board deliberated and then fired Shaper by unanimous vote. The resolution terminating him said that the university, the state, and the nation require unqualified loyalty on the part of all teachers at the university, coupled with willingness and ability by precept and example to further the national purpose in the present crisis. The regents made clear that they had dismissed Shaper solely for statements that he had just made in the boardroom. He probably could have kept his job if he had projected a more obsequious attitude. He was, however, in no mood to cooperate. Shaper left the university that afternoon unemployed, and he would not find another academic job for 8 years. So I'm going to stop there. While we're getting ready for some questions, if you're interested in purchasing the book, here are some possibilities. You can order it online from Minnesota Historical Society Press. It comes pretty quickly. Or at one of the Minnesota Historical Society shops, like at the History Center, the Mill City Museum, etc. Or at your local independent bookstore, like Majors and Quinn or Next Chapter Booksellers in St. Paul. Okay, Kay?
Okay, we'll leave that up there for just a minute in case you want to write anything down. Okay, first question that we do have is, this person says, I read that one of the feelings about the war was that it was being fought for the benefit of munitions companies. Was this a common feeling in Minnesota?
Yes, absolutely. So the people who opposed the war, and this would include Charles Lindbergh and people in the Nonpartisan League and many people in the German American communities, people who were really trying to stop the war from happening, did feel that they were being dragged into war basically for economic reasons. The munitions company would be one thing, but the bigger issue had to do with the big loans that Wall Street had made to Britain and France. So Britain and France were buying, a lot of food and war materials from the United States, but they ran out of credit, and so J.P. Morgan organized a big loan campaign, which include, by the way, James J. Hill here in St. Paul, to loan them a lot more money so that they could keep buying things from the U.S. And of course, once the U.S. declared war, then that problem was solved for the British and the French. So there was a lot of talk about how Wall Street, the money trust, is dragging us into war, and also that a lot of people in the labor movement and among the farmers wondering who profits from the war, and so they kept thinking about the munitions companies. There was talk about among the in the labor movement, in the Nonpartisan League, that maybe munitions factories should be nationalized, so that there wasn't this impetus to make money off the war. So it was a powerful thing in places like Minnesota, at least among farmers and trade union people, to make that argument and to be opposed to the war, partially for that reason.
Okay. How do you think the war-related events at home gained support for prohibition and women's suffrage in Minnesota?
Well, yeah. So let me do prohibition first. The Commission for Public Safety. Let me back up a little bit. by the time you get to 1917, when the U.S. entered the war, there had been obviously the prohibition movement was been going on for a long time, and it had some success. So in Minnesota, they weren't able to pass a statewide amendment outlawing alcohol, but they did in Minnesota succeed in passing what was called the local option law. So the local option law allowed counties and cities to have referendums, and so a county could become dry, that is to say, no alcohol produced or sold, or stay what they call wet. And so by 1917, already about half the counties were dry based on local referendums, and some cities were too. So this was all going on. Now, the Commission for Public Safety was very concerned about alcohol, and they were really afraid that drinking was going to undermine recruiting for the military, for training for the military, and for war production. So they were extremely concerned about this. They were probably all very favorable to prohibition themselves. They didn't want to go so far, although the prohibition movement was trying to pressure them to pass a order banning alcohol sales for the duration of the war. But they did pass lots of orders limiting alcohol sales throughout the state. A lot of orders. It was a big part of what they did. And so, of course, after the war was over, one of the first things that happened was that the Prohibition Amendment was finally passed. And I think what happened during the war did advance that cause, partially because many people who were opposed to Prohibition were German Americans. You think of all the German breweries in Minnesota at that time and in Wisconsin. And so this sort of feeling that Germans were disloyal and Germans drank too much kind of came together, and I think increased support for Prohibition after the war was over. In terms of suffrage, the suffrage amendment also passed shortly after the war, but not as easily as the Prohibition amendment. So this is a long debate. I mean, this is not really resolved. I mean, so as I mentioned, the women's movement split, and so you could ask, did the tactic of the mainstream part of the women's suffrage movement, that is to say, supporting the war effort, did that help pass the suffrage amendment, or did the National Women's Party's more aggressive picketing, etc., did that help pass the women's suffrage amendment? Well, maybe they both contributed to that, and eventually it did pass, although not right away, because there was still trouble trying to get all the Democrats online. It wasn't until the Republicans took control of Congress after 1918 that the suffrage amendment finally passed.
Okay. What and when was it that brought the farmers and labor together as a political party?
Well, it was it was a process, and as I said, I think that the transit strike at the end of 1918 was the beginning of it, because what happened is that the Nonpartisan League was already under the gun from the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety. They were being banned around the state, and there was all this violence. And then the labor movement in the Twin Cities saw that the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety was their true enemy. I mean, they were negotiating with the Transit Committee, but they could see that the Commission for Public Safety was lining up to try to protect the transit company from having to sign a union contract. So these two groups of people became self-supportive. And I mean, the fact that they had a very clear common enemy tended to bring them together. So that was just the beginning. I mean, the process took a while. It wasn't really until I guess it was 1922 that the Farmer Labor Party first came together and won a statewide election when Henrik Shipstad won the U.S. Senate seat. So it was a process that went on for a couple of years, but I think that you can really trace the origins of it back to that strike, where in kind of the heat of that battle, farmers and workers began to see themselves as allies.
Okay. After the war, as the soldiers returned to Minnesota, what was the mood of the state? Were they honored as heroes that won the Great War, or were they just quietly returned to their previous lives?
Well, they were definitely honored. I mean, basically, the mainstream newspapers, I mean, the business community of every city and county were all, obviously celebrated them. One of the things that happened, though, I should say, to Minnesotans who went to war, is that although I mentioned that, like, for example, the 4 National Guard units all got sent together. They actually got sent together to a place called Camp Cody in New Mexico, where they were formed into a new division. But what happened to those National Guard units, which they were really unhappy about, is that their unit cohesion kept breaking down. So some of them would be transferred to different units. New people were brought in their units, and pretty soon there was really no way for those 3 infantry units that went to Camp Cody to really be identified as Minnesota units. The only exception was the artillery unit, field artillery unit of the National Guard. They got sent to a separate camp and joined what was called the Rainbow Division, the 34th Division, and soon went to France. And they always retained their unit cohesion. So they were the only ones, when they came back as a unit, were recognizably Minnesotans. And there was an enormous parade in both Minneapolis and St. Paul. There's a great picture in the book. They built a huge white temporary triumphal arch over a street in St. Paul that it's called the 151st Field Artillery Brigade marched through as part of their victory celebration on their way home. Unfortunately, the other soldiers, when they came home, were kind of coming home as individuals because the cohesion of their original National Guard units was broken up. It was really kind of unfortunate. Only the 151st really stayed together as a Minnesota unit.
Right. And I just know personally, like my grandfather served in World War I, and he stayed in the Army of Occupation and didn't
Oh,
come
yeah,
home
right,
until the end of 1920.
right.
So there's soldiers who
Yes,
just came home quietly well after.
right. That's right. There was a lot. That's true. And so, yeah, people were trickling home basically individually. And it could be, like you said, it could be a year later.
Mhm.
Yeah. Oh,
So,
by the way, I should say also that Fort Snelling, which had been a training camp for officers during the war, was the site of a major military hospital after the war, a hospital that not only for recovery but also for things like prosthetics, etc. And so, for about a year, Fort Snelling operated as a major receiving hospital for soldiers coming back who were wounded.
okay. Did other states have the equivalent of the Commission on Public Safety?
Um, that's a good question, and it's hard to say exactly because there's a lot of states, and I can't say that I know what happened in all of them. So here's what happened. The federal government actually asked states to set up some sort of a statewide committee to organize the mobilization for the war. The national organization was called the Council for National Defense, and they asked local groups to set up local councils of national defense to organize to make sure that there was labor in the factories, labor in the farm fields, et cetera, et cetera. So before that even was asked, the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety had already been created by the business community in St. Paul. So it really was a very unique group, and as far as I can tell, had more power and was more repressive than almost anywhere else in the country. Primarily because they had these very important enemies that they were very concerned about stopping, especially the Nonpartisan League. So if you look, for example, at Wisconsin, which is a good state to compare because Wisconsin and Minnesota were very similar in some ways. Both had very large German American populations. They both had one major city, and that major city, both Minneapolis and Milwaukee, both had socialist mayors. But the Wisconsin legislature didn't set up something like the Commission for Public Safety. They set up a Council for National Defense. And one of the things about that Council for National Defense is that the legislation in Wisconsin mandated that it had to have a labor representative and a farmer representative, which was something that obviously the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety did not do. I mean, at all. And so, they didn't create a home guard. I mean, it was really very different in Wisconsin, just for example, even though Wisconsin and Minnesota were very similar states. Now, this is not to say that there weren't terrible things that happened in Wisconsin. There was a lot of vigilante violence in Wisconsin. My mother's hometown up in Ashland, there was a number of faculty at Northland College up in Ashland that were tarred and feathered because they were supposedly not loyal enough. So there's a lot of stuff that went on. But the state itself, the state government itself, was not as repressive. It didn't have anything quite like the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety. So that's Wisconsin. But like I say, there's lots of states, and I'm not sure I can speak for what happened in every part of the country.
So, in terms of the Commission on Public Safety, uh, did it end at the end of the war?
Yes, and I should have said that. One of the things about the Commission for Public Safety is that when the armistice happened in November of 1918, the commissioners realized that they should start wrapping things up. And partially that was because they understood that in the after the first of the year, maybe it was in March or April, I'm not sure, of 1919, the legislature would be back in session. So their kind of reason for being, which was to take the place of the legislature for the duration of the war, would no longer exist. So they started wrapping things up. However, there was a lot of effort to try to preserve some of the things that they had done. So, for example, there was a bill in the legislature trying to preserve the motor corps. But there was huge pushback from the labor movement because the labor movement saw the motor corps as basically aimed at them. And the National Guard wasn't particularly interested in sharing its funds with the motor corps either. So that failed. But there was various attempts to try to keep some of what they had gained from the business community's point of view after the war. But the commission itself by 1919 had folded up its shop and ended.
So, did later state legislation make it more difficult to establish something like that again, or to establish a state equivalent of the Espionage Act?
Well, this is a good question, which I don't think I can answer. I mean, it would be really interesting to look very closely at what happened in Minnesota on the running up to World War II and during World War II. I mean, my general sense is that nothing like that happened in Minnesota during World War II. So I don't know. But it'd be interesting to think more about why that was the case. I really think what happened in Minnesota during World War I had to do with a confluence of a number of things happening at the same time, which is why I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the push by the Nonpartisan League, having a socialist mayor, the International Workers of the World organizing up on the range and in the lumberjacks. All these things were going on that made the business community very anxious to sort of take control. And I don't think that was so much the case, apparently, in World War II. But I can't say, for example, it's a really good question. It'd be a really interesting comparative study to look at what happened in Minnesota in those two wars side by side.
Okay. Okay, one thing I was thinking about, people keep asking questions. I'm going to ask one here. What really struck me was all of the issues that were kind of around at that time, a century later, seem to be somewhat issues that are still here in a slightly different context, but just how it makes you realize in some ways history repeats itself in slightly different forms. But
Yeah.
I was like thinking of the subtext of with okay, I'm totally missing the word here again. The prohibition.
Uh-huh.
Taking what some might consider moral argument and politicizing it, and
Wow.
things like the women's movement and you know big big companies versus and the rich versus the small,
Yeah.
and it's just I find it really interesting to read through this and see those correlations,
Right.
and just wondering if you felt you were seeing that as you were writing.
Yes. Well, this is obviously a very complicated question. I mean, one of the things, of
Right.
course, is that um, people used to talk about the Gilded Age in this period around the early 1900s as this remarkable period of economic inequality. But I think now we've pretty much exceeded that. And so, back then, the populists of various kinds in the Nonpartisan League and the labor movement were always, upset about what they call the oligarchy of, big grain millers in Minneapolis, et cetera. But now we see actual billionaires, having a huge role in running governments. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of similarities there. Obviously, the things about immigrants, I mean, anti-immigrant ideology was a big part of what happened in 1917. The Minnesota Commissioner of Public Safety was very concerned about, especially not only Germans, but also Scandinavians. Always worried, John McGee was always worried that they were, going to be disloyal in some way or another. And when Joseph Bernquist campaigned in 1918, he talked very frankly about, immigrants should be deported if they're not loyal, et cetera, et cetera. Their property should be taken. It was very similar in many ways to some of the rhetoric of these days. And then I think just generally, one of the things this whole story shows is how fragile democratic institutions are. I mean, essentially what happened in 1917 in Minnesota was kind of a coup where the business community kind of took over running the government and with lots of power and really no checks on their power. Basically the newspapers, which might have been more critical, kind of went along with it. As I mentioned, even sometimes applauding mob violence, which is really kind of scary for newspapers to do that. And so it was concerning. The best thing you could say about the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety is that when the armistice came, it stopped, it wrapped things up. Mm-hmm. But for the duration of the war, there was really no check on it. The courts didn't try to stop it. The newspapers were not very critical. And they basically did whatever they wanted to do. And so you saw things like what happened at the University of Minnesota. Due process and basic rights kind of went out the window.
Yeah. Just like I know there was censorship, books taken out of libraries. As a librarian, I know that the library side of things,
yeah.
But lots of like German language books or
right.
ones by Germans or we in Minnesota did not really have book burnings, but there were that happened in some other states, and it's just there's a lot of things that there seem to be similarities, and here we have a couple of okay, we'll get to this one in a moment, but here someone's asking, was there an active group of conscientious objectors in World War I?
Yeah, so there were, I mean, mostly they came, it was the Socialist Party that mostly organized most of the draft resistors. So I should say, this is one more part of the story. The Socialist Party was, fairly strong in Minnesota, especially it was stronger other places. But when the war came, the Socialist Party had a big national convention, and the majority voted to oppose the war, even though the war had started. And then there was a minority that said, "Okay, we don't like the war, but we have to support it as Americans." So Tom Van Leer, for example, was in the minority view. He was the mayor. He said, I don't like the war. He was critical of the war, but he said, we are not going to do anything to stand in the way. We're going to, do what needs to be done to keep an orderly society for the duration of the war, including things like buying Liberty bonds or whatever. Okay, so but anyway, on the more radical radical side of the Socialist Party, there was a number of young men who refused induction. And in fact, the U.S. Supreme Court case that eventually decided that the Selective Service system was constitutional was based on cases that arose out of Minnesota by these young socialist men. It wasn't decided until January 1918, and they had argued that Selective Service violated the 13th Amendment against involuntary servitude, et cetera. And anyway, the court eventually held that the Selective Service law was constitutional. And so now in those days, a person who refused induction could often be punished not just by going to prison, but actually by being inducted. So many draft refusers ended up in camps where the Army tried to coerce them into wearing a uniform and becoming part of the military. Sometimes that succeeded, and sometimes it didn't. And sometimes there were some pretty awful cases of what happened to those guys. So yeah, there was a draft resistance movement, and I think it was from what I know was mostly based among young men of the Socialist Party.
Mhm. Okay. Events leading up to the next World War were only a few years apart.
Yeah.
What were the similarities or changes did you see in any of your research in terms of the political and economic landscape during that time? I know you didn't study this as much, but
Yeah, that's a really big question. Um, and I'm not sure exactly what to say. I mean, those years after the armistice were pretty ugly years. A lot of really terrible things happened in 1919, 1920. There was a big roundup of the IWW and for other socialists, a lot of deportations. There was a lot of violent strikes that went on. There was some terrible, awful racial violence that went on, including the awful riot in Chicago, Washington, D.C., and other places. You know, there was another, this is a whole other part of the book that we haven't talked about much about, but the African American community nationwide, led by the NAACP, decided to support the war, and with sort of the same reason that the mainstream women's suffrage movement did, feeling that if they supported the war and if they encouraged people to enlist and to fight, that it would lead to major reforms after the war. And what they meant by major reforms was dealing with Jim Crow laws, an anti-lynching bill, etc. But none of those things happened. And in fact, the violence after the war was against African Americans was really terrible. I mean, there's cases of African American soldiers in uniform coming back and being lynched. I mean, it was really awful. So it was really a terrible time. And then things. This is through the 20s. There's also kind of a boom time in terms of the general economy, but not for farmers. There was basically a farm depression right in the 20s. And then, then we get to the depression. And so everything begins to transform by a new gigantic historical process that
mhm.
really, leads to different things. So it's complicated. I think I'm going to stop there. I really can't go any
Yeah.
farther. Yeah.
Gonna say we were isolationist a little shorter from in staying out of the war for the
Yeah.
second one, much shorter time frame than the first.
Yeah.
So,
Right. But again, it was still a debate for sure.
yep.
Right. Yeah.
So, how did the NPL, how is it related to what became the DFL, or was there still having come out of okay, also with the Republicans? It's kind of
Yeah. So the nonpartisan league, had this. The original tactic was to run within the open primaries of existing parties, primarily the Republican Party. But after the war, after World War I, in the early 1919, early 20s, that became more difficult to do. And so what happened was that the nonpartisan league farmers and then trade unionists organized as kind of a working class nonpartisan league began to nominate candidates together. And that's where the Farmer Labor Party began to grow. And eventually the nonpartisan league, at least in Minnesota, just went out of existence. And this new coalition emerged and formally called itself a party, the Farmer Labor Party. And this is, it's really quite remarkable because third parties are really difficult to organize
mhm.
under our political system. But the Farmer Labor Party, because of this coalition that they had built over several years of farmers and trade unionists, were able to get a good start. And frankly, they were also aided by the fact that the Democratic Party was pretty weak. So pretty soon, the nonpartisan league was the second largest. I mean, the Farmer Labor Party was the second largest party. This is by 1922 or so, and was able to contend often with the Republicans for various offices. And then when I get to the 30s, they managed to elect the governor for like 5 different times throughout the 30 up until 1938. Floyd B. Olson and then Elmer Benson. So it's a even from a national level, it's a very interesting story because it's so difficult to organize um, a third party, and for a third party to be successful at the level that the Farmer Labor Party was successful for a while. And then, of course, after World War II, the Democratic Party led by Hubert Humphrey, and by that time the Farmer Labor Party was kind of struggling. So then we get this merger process that went on, I guess it was 1947 when the two parties, the Democratic Party and the Farmer Labor Party, came together and became the DFL, which
Mhm.
it's still called today.
Now, how was the 1918 flu pandemic a factor during this
Ah,
time?
my gosh, another big part of the story that we haven't talked about yet. Yeah, so the flu, the pandemic, and the war are really linked incredibly. And in fact, the major historians of the flu pandemic in 1918 uh, think that it's very likely the case that the flu really broke out in among the big training camps of the military, especially the one in Kansas. It's called Fort Funston. That's where, at least, that's where the first cases came up in 1917. And so, and then what would happen? See, the military, as I mentioned, we were trying to build a huge army like from scratch really quickly. So they set up these enormous camps. There'd be 20 or 30,000 soldiers living together, really tight quarters and barracks. And when that flu broke out in one of those camps, it spread very quickly. And then the military was very anxious in getting these troops, after they were trained, moved to the East Coast and on ships. And so they kept moving infected soldiers to the east. There was outbreaks on some of the troop ships, and then they brought the flu to Europe, and eventually it even affected the Germans across the border. So the war, really was a great aid in spreading the influenza, and then it had a big impact on troops from both sides. I mean, it didn't really determine the outcome of the war because on both sides of the line in France, soldiers were suffering from the flu. The Germans and the Americans, British and the French on the other side. So it was a really difficult time for everybody. Back in the U.S., of course, then we had the second wave that came through in November of 1918 through all the cities, and then by January 1919, it pretty much burnt itself out. It was a terrible time. So people, when you mentioned about troops coming home being celebrated, they were being celebrated right in the middle sometimes of these flu pandemics, which was really a problem.
Mhm.
The flu is an interesting thing for me because one of the reasons I got interested in this to begin with, and as I said about interested in how it affects the lives of individuals, is that my grandfather was an immigrant from Austria-Hungary. He was actually a German ethnic immigrant from the Hungarian side of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg Empire. And he came over in 1907, I think. And one of the reasons for people his age coming over was trying to avoid being drafted into the Habsburg army, which was a really bad idea, no matter what was happening, especially if a war was coming. And then when he got here, he was faced with the draft again. And he was 28 at that time, but you had to register if you were up to 30. And he registered in June of 1917. And he told us that he would have done anything to avoid being drafted. But as it happened, he got a dependency deferment because he was married and had a 4-year-old son. But then in November of 1918, his wife died in the influenza pandemic. And so I was just kind of struck by this. It seems like so many parts of the story affected my grandfather, like it did so many people. The coming of the war, nationalism, conscription, influenza pandemic. I mean, he faced them all and somehow survived through it. So then he married again, and that person he married again was my own grandmother, of course. Yeah.
Okay, well, we're almost to the end of time. Just going to say a thing or two here. Um, Someone said that there's a movie about the Nonpartisan League a little bit. It's
Mhm.
fiction, but it's called Northern Lights, and it's from
Yeah.
1978. You have to do a little hunting to maybe see if you can find it somewhere to watch, but that's
Yeah,
the
I was
movie.
actually at the Film Society not too long ago. I went and saw it again. I saw it many years ago, and I think it's available online somewhere that you can watch it. It's really worth seeing.
Yeah, so put in Northern Lights, and then 1978 is when that
Yeah.
one came out. And one last thing before we go, besides saying thank you, Greg, is somebody, Pete Gorman. I'm just going to put this out there because Pete says, "This has been great, Greg, from a long ago former friend."
Yeah, I
So,
remember the name. Thank you.
so I wanted to make sure you got that.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
thank you so much for just sharing your knowledge. I know you worked a long time on this. It's a labor of passion and definitely worth seeking out, and hopefully it's piqued a lot of people's interest to go seek out your book. Um, Definitely a good read, and we are thankful that you got to spend time with us, and this will be up on YouTube in a bit, and also we'll post it on the library website for access. And we will be back again next week with a talk about the Curlin collection at the University of Minnesota, which is a huge archive of children's literature, and it's really a fascinating place. So,
Could I just say also, I just want to thank you again
yeah.
for organizing this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm always happy to have local authors on as a scholar. So, okay, everyone, we're gonna sign off and see you next week. Bye.
Bye.